The incentive is the commodification of ourselves and nature and the biosphere. Well, that's not a survival tactic. So so again, I think there's a principled way of doing this. I think we're not arbitrarily issuing tokens. We can have a principled way of doing the supply based on free energy principle, and we can achieve autonomy. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is the allocation of tokens. We use the free energy principle as a basis, saying here's value created, actually reduced uncertainty. That is a new unit of value. That is not inflationary. You increase the pie, that in a sense. Then we use something called the Shapley value, which has come out of game theory, cooperative game theory. Lloyd Shapley got a Nobel Prize for this, and it allocates tokens based upon your marginal contribution to that outcome. So, and at the same time, you're creating an incentive curve that actually is designed to solve these problems, and then create an asset class that reflects that as a public good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mindplex community podcast, Dream Wonders, where we explore groundbreaking ideas shaping our world. And today, I'm very honored and happy to have with us John Henry Clippinger, who is a visionary thinker and pioneer in the fields of decentralized systems, generative governance, and digital identity. I met John at MIT, and I think it was about 10 years ago. So John, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
and we clicked. We clicked then. It was a governance workshop, and I think John presented, and I remember maybe also I was presenting, and I was on a panel with bankers, and I told them that banks will disappear altogether because crypto is coming. Of course, not yet, but we clicked, and John invited me, and I was so fortunate to be among let's say a dozen of amazing innovators who he invited at 2 consecutive retreats at his Windhover retreat.
Wow, that's right.
Yes, which resulted in the Windhover transition. And he also, that was my first time at Bretton Woods. So he invited us during the first retreat to a lunch at Bretton Woods, which was for me an epic moment because we entered the room where actually everything happened,
right.
as they say in Hamilton. So, yes. Yeah. I was there, yes, in that room. And not when that thing happened, but when we were kind of planning this, and it resulted next year with the Windhover transition, and we also, under John's leadership, managed to write a book. To which I contributed a chapter on organic governance, which is from and that is From Bitcoin to Burning Man and Beyond, which I recommend. It's still very, very current. So yes, I recommend to our audience to delve into that. So John, we actually haven't been in touch much, but we have parallel, yes, and converged again. And that is around these first principles. And so you are, I think it's kind of natural, our convergence, as we are seeking more organic ways of governance. And you have now started to delve into first principles and how do they apply to governance, and looking at nature and more, to call it biologically plausible ways or organic governance.
Right.
And I recently, yes, was invited to the London Futurists for their Christmas thing, and I came across 2 books. One, First Principles and First Values, co-authored by Ken Wilber, who is the integral philosophy guru, and also another one Cosmological Theories of Values, which is written by a NASA scientist, Mark Lupicella. I do not know if you have seen it, but these two books converge. One is more spiritual, more integral, more philosophical. The other one is Springer, and it is a purely scientific book, which makes a case that actually values are universal, and that what's wrong in our world today is because we departed from those values. And this is, I think, what you are exploring also in your first principles new endeavor. Right. But before we delve into that, I'd like to tell our audience a bit more about you. So, with a scientific and entrepreneurial career spanning technology, law, and social innovation, John is a leading advocate for using blockchain, artificial intelligence, and token economies to foster equitable and sustainable systems. He is the author of influential works like A Crowd of One, in which he explored, and I think that's his passion, self-sovereignty, yes, in the digital economy. Yes. Yeah. And then the biology of business, which goes hand in hand with my work when I held the Canada Research Chair. And of course, this is my lifetime work, I can call it, on the holonic enterprise. Right. And his research has informed global discussions on governance, ethics, and the future of human collaboration. So we met also at the Aspen Institute. We met, at the World Economic Forum. So we kind of intersect, yes. And so what I want to start with, John, while I'm also, of course, welcoming you to the podcast, is what inspired you to explore these issues, the self-sovereignty, the governance, and their, yes.
I'll put it in context in terms of my own personal narrative and sort of how I got into this, and I think it helps frame it towards a larger conversation about what are first principles, why that's such an important perspective. So it goes way back. I mean, way back. And when I was a teenager, I was very interested in the work of Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if people are familiar with him, but the whole idea, the phenomenon of man, and he talked about something called the geosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere. And that was a really unusual idea at that time. And it was heretical. He was a paleontologist, a Jesuit, and he developed this idea, and it was considered to be off the rails. And yet I got interested in that through cybernetics and the work of cybernetics, where you have teleological systems, engineering systems that are goal directed. And I say, well, there is a way of talking about agency and teleology without necessarily going into the notion of design and some of the other more questionable approaches. And then I got very interested in the concept of self-organizing systems. What is a self-organizing system? And so it was that I started reading the works of Ross Ashby, who's really one of he coined the term, actually, self-organizing systems. And he was one of the real pioneers in cybernetics. And so as a young kid, I got to meet Warren McCulloch, who developed McCulloch and Pitts. And so I was really immersed in that world. And then so I did a master's thesis on a computer simulation of neoorganisms. Like neoorganisms, it was like basically what we now may call memes, but virtual systems, and how they were subject to the law of requisite variety. This was 1968, so a long time ago.
Can I endeavor and ask you in what year? I know it's a long, but you're a pioneer, and this can prove it.
That was 1968.
Wow.
And then I moved over. I was doing my thesis, and you had all these computing facilities then at MIT. MIT was really the leader in doing Lisp modeling and programming, and so I got invited to go to the AI, artificial intelligence lab, and I worked with Terry Winograd, who was doing it. He had a thesis on what is called Sherdlu, which had a natural language system that talked about a robotic environment. But there was also a language that was called Conniver, that was a distributed system Rather than doing a planning, it was a fully distributed system. And I wanted to say, well, how could we model cognition as a multi-agent system, and then derive a computer model of that? And we actually put it to a Turing test and use psychoanalytic transcripts in order to say, well, what created this text? What reverse engineer? What kind of mechanism? It's very clear it wasn't a top-down mechanism, because there were all these interruptions that are happening. People were talking. One part of our conversation would kick into another, and it was not, you could not model it as a monolithic thing. So I did those, and this came a book called Meaning and Discourse that was published Johns Hopkins, and Steve Kosslin got behind it. And out of that, then Dan Dennett, we got to know Dan, and he was talking about the homunculus. And so Dan was sort of sympathetic to these ideas, and Jerry Adelman, who was in neurodarwinism. But those ideas were a little premature for the time. That was not how. And I think this is one of the things that's really interested me in the transition in AI. AI in that time was really sort of an engineering enterprise. It was not based upon fundamentals of science. And I was also interested in computational linguistics, and it was still governed by certain kind of formalisms rather than under a fundamental set of principles. And so it was an engineering tour de force. So I got interested in issues of governance because I thought, what's happening with information computers? There's a privacy issue here that we have no idea. And so at that time, I went over to Harvard, worked with the information resources program recommended Tony Ottinger, and that became then I got interested in the issues of privacy and governance, because I said, well, you got these computers, who's going to govern them? And so I joined administration in the Carter administration as young, and we set up, there was an agency called National Telecommunications and Information. We put the I in that and started talking about privacy. So the idea of governance was something that I was really interested in from early on, and recognizing that you had technologies, and you had technology that really complex intelligence systems were self-organizing. It wasn't a planned system. It was, to understand something, it wasn't from the outside in, it was from the inside out. And that's more of a biological system. How do these things emerge? How do they self-organize? How do they maintain their coherence and be what they were? And how do they stay alive? So we can talk about intelligence in a very sort of different way than sort of, being able to solve math problems. Is like, it's sort of fundamental. To be alive is to be intelligent, in a sense, is make predictions about the world. And this is where it ties into the work of the notion of the good controller regulator theorem of Ashby and a requisite variety, which was very influential in Carl Friston's work. So this is where I'm moving up to say, and to the present, is that Carl Friston was really talking about some of Ashby's ideas of saying, what is it for something to stay alive is make predictions, and how does it separate itself from the world in which it's in? And this brought in the whole notion of Markov blankets, which from Judeo-Pearl, which I think is very profound, is sort of a minimal basis for saying, how does something separate itself from something out, and then what actions does it take in order to preserve itself? And so we're getting back to sort of first principles, and the idea of saying, okay, what if intelligence is not just not being able to solve more complex word problems faster or math problems, is something fundamental to being alive, and it varies about different contexts. I mean, and this is where the biology, I think, comes in important, in the sense this could be something for us to discuss, is that there isn't a single optimum physical form, because there are trade-offs between, if you're going to be a long distance runner, you're not going to be a big weightlifter, you're not going to be as fast rate. There are all these trade-offs that exist that are niche dependent. And so what's the fundamentals behind intelligence? And this is where I think the physics has come in, and understanding the free energy principle, and at least action. And what I've been trying to understand with the first principle first is saying, well, is there a general consensus is to what the nature of intelligence is in a sense, and or sentience, making so being aware of what's around you, and this is, if you start to look at a number of physicists, they're saying, well, maybe. And this Don Hoffman makes these points that this space time is not fundamental. There's something a fundamental consciousness, or how to frame that, in the nature of the universe, in nature reality. And so it's not energy. You're not we have a reductionist mentality. Even the idea of an objective observer goes out with quantum mechanics. So you're saying, okay, there's a whole, and I this may be this is a new era of how we see ourselves, I think, and it becomes, you mentioned this as a singularity, but it's like and there's the wonderful piece, James Lovelock, that you mentioned in the Nova scene, his piece, I think was, he captures it. Here was the man who was the inventor of the concept, the Gaia principle, and now he's saying we're going from the Anthropocene into a Novocene, in which there are new categories of living sentient things that we co-evolve with. And I think that's very hard for people to accept. I mean, because the premise is that we're on top and everything is going to be fit into us. But even our sense of our own identity and sort of reifying that as a fixed point, I think creates a lot of problems. And I think this is part of what you've been saying, and that ties into governance and what's a principal basis for having governance. Um, and I think that, having been in government and in business, and they'll talk about, oh, well, governance is sort of an afterthought. You make a mess and then you put something on top of it, right? And you say, oh, we'll undo that mess. Well, you're always a laggard. You're always lagging. Um, and so it has to be inherent into the process itself. And that itself is a very different notion of governance than in the current narrative. And having been in government, and as you mentioned, I was at the Berkman Center for 12 years, and the whole idea of digital institutions and self-governance, still the inclination of people is to say, oh, well, we're going to slap something on, we're going to impose a limitation rather than understand the dynamics by which these things define themselves. And we and you know and for Sir Francis Bacon had, I think, got it right. I mean, the inventor of it, he said, in order to have dominion over nature, we first need to understand nature. We need to obey nature. And so and we can't get out on top of it and impose our own limitations on it. We constantly are going to have to be. It's a process of discovery and redefinition. So that's a very different point of view than the current point of view. And I know, and I know from watching some of your podcasts and conversations, is that one comes up against this sort of default notion of governance. At the same time, it doesn't mean something is it does. Living things are always living within a boundary, within a niche. And you asked some really good questions about what happens with sort of, you say, the zero sum trap, is that things are trying to mutually define themselves in terms of other things. And this goes back to the law of requisite variety. In other words, in order for this thing to exist, it has to model, it has to have the requisite variety, representation of this thing outside itself, or it will be dominated by this thing. So there's an inherent sort of energy in life in order to the mutual representation of larger forms of complexity. And so if I would say there's a principle of governance, and you mentioned in the questions, I think it's sort of the increasing of complexity, cognitive complexity over time. And so you can incorporate, and this becomes a polystable system. This is what Ashby talks about, in being able to say, he talks about homeostatic systems are highly stable, resistant to variabilities. You actually have to increase the variety of these things. So it's a different design point, than is traditionally applied to as government or governance, that we're in. So does that sort of kick off the conversation here?
Totally. And it's like, okay, my mind is blowing with so many questions and so
Yeah.
many directions in which we can go from here. And honestly, I don't know where to start, but I will start with this one. Yes, we are at a, this the cusp of a new era, as you mentioned, Novacine, in which we will have to govern, self-govern, or whatever, with
Yeah.
other kinds of intelligences, yes, around us. And of course, there are many, many issues here in which we can go on many rabbit holes, and I will just mention a few, but these are not the questions for right now. So, of course, yes, well, these new intelligences treat us as we treat chimps, or monkeys, or will they respect us? How will we raise them so they co-create with us and actually they help us flourish? Does it make sense, or we just make room for the new thing, which is them, as Lovelock was saying, that cyborgs will replace humans and remake the world because we cannot. We can only destroy it. But I will leave this for later, because you mentioned so many things, and some of them, in my opinion, are contradictory. So one is the need for biological plausibility. Yes, and this is uh, also, of course, mirrored in. I had a podcast with Stephen Grossberg, whose work on adaptive resonance theory, and he published a book, actually not just his last book is called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain. And he proves, actually, in his lifetime work, he's 85 now, and I followed his work since I was a postdoc. He
Hmm.
proved that the brain and the phenomenology of the brain is actually directed and biased towards goodness. There is an asymmetry in the brain that is biasing us towards goodness. And this is, I think, the force or the drive for life that life has, and of the evolution. Because otherwise, we wouldn't maybe
No,
even not appear, right? Because, I mean, life would have destroyed itself, which we are actually kind of on that path, which is
no,
very
no, it's true. It's
strange.
true. It's true. It's true.
Yes, and then the other one, is McGilchrist, which, I mean, he published recently a sequel to his The Master and Its Emissary, and it's called The Matter with Things. And he also proved, he's a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, and all that, and he proved that life, or at least he has this hypothesis that life evolved to respond to universal value, and that is again coming to that goodness, like beauty, goodness, truth, that we are moved by these things, and
Mm.
love is the force that moves towards
Right.
those things, and it is in us. Okay, so these things come together, and that is, again, yeah, first principles, first values. We will see how they go together. But then Hoffman comes and tells us, oh no, I mean, yes, all what we see is something else. So, do you think that what Hoffman says, and I'm fascinated by his work, the
Yeah.
case
Yeah.
against
Yeah.
reality and all that, do you
Yeah.
think that is also biologically plausible, or it's something else which we don't know and don't understand? Just because you mentioned Hoffman, and then we can delve into the other topic. What's your opinion? Is this biologically plausible? Or it's something completely different and has to do much more with this alien
Well, I mean,
intelligence?
so okay. I mean, 2 points. I mean, I get back to this idea of the inherent goodness, and then that is very much like Pierre de Chardin. I mean, that his omega point, he makes that, and how do you translate that into a more antiseptic language of science? But that, to me, is the law of requisite variety too. Is and actually, when you start looking at some of Hoffman's work, he talks not just about Markov blankets, but Markov kernels, and basically where he talks about two, and then this ties into Chris Field's work, and he and Chris Fields have done work together, and Chris is a quantum information theorist, um, and I think and you have it's sort of like physics is a communication across boundaries, which is really, and you have these different entities trying to model themselves and create compound entities of greater complexity, because that has survival value. That meets the criteria of Hamiltonian. There's the least action or the free energy principle. So you and that's why I'm intrigued by that notion. And then when I first encountered Carl's work, was that I said, oh, really? I mean, that's a pretty powerful notion. And uh, and yet, if you start to look hard at the physics, and it's just like, yes, there's an optimization function. Nature does it tries to find the least costly path, or the action, the least action to an outcome, which in turn means for things representing themselves. And I would argue this ties into Leonard Susskind's work on the holographic universe and the ability, and his recent work on the second law of quantum complexity. So there is this energy that is trying to represent itself all different states in different forms, and you can see that as the good in a sense, because it's not optimizing around a single function or a single. And that in my view, where we've gotten ourselves in trouble is that you have an economic system that was taken from Newtonian mechanics. It's a mechanical system, um, and you had Adam Smith take a version of it, but he's not really fairly represented, because it was not just the invisible hand. He talked about the moral sentiments, and so there's a balancing point there. But you're optimizing around a single, which you would call the zero sum trap. Um, and in fact, what you rather than having parties look at information asymmetries and resolve them into a Pareto optimum or equilibrium, the free energy principle says, no, here's a set of principles. We're not arbitraging information asymmetries. Here's a set of principles that actually measurably reduce uncertainty. And so it's agentic in itself. So one of the things I'm really involved in is a new kind of economics. There's a homeostatic economics that uses the free energy principle as established a interim measures of value had to direct sort of an outcome that is a positive outcome, and this becomes an intentionality of the firm. Um, and that's a different kind of economics. And I think we can talk about creating public goods, common pool resources there, where you can it actually upends a lot of how we create traditional economics. So from my vantage point, I think, wow, we're on the threshold of a profoundly different economics, which I think is life preserving. If you say what's the good, it's a life enhancing, it's a life preserving system, not an extractive system. So you value the creation and diversity of life rather than its extraction into some kind of commodified asset that some smaller group of people can monetize. Um, so that's where I am on this. And what's interesting, um, in Hoffman's work, and I also did an interview with Stuart Hameroff, who's worked with Roger Penrose, and I have to say I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. That and he has this little diagram of a yin and the yang of sort of classical space, space time interacting with quantum multidimensional Hilbert spaces, and that what consciousness is the and life is the interaction between the two. And I think we're now starting to lift the veil and understand that interface. And that to me is quite exciting. And so when he claims that, and it wasn't just him, there's some more recent experiments saying, I don't know if you saw those, but
and can I just interject
sure.
there, because this is exactly this what Stephen Grossberg also proved in his book, chapter 17. I just read it because so he is using exactly that, the yin and yang principle, and he says that actually, yes, there is this, but there's an asymmetry in the brain that is still driving us towards this, as you say, life preserving. Yes, it's like, and that is the goodness, what he calls goodness. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, but what they're actually doing is seeing in microtubules, they're seeing a structure, a crystalline structure, what they even call a time crystal, of how you're able to maintain super resonance radiance at room temperatures, which was supposed to be impossible in quantum mechanics. You had absolute zero, and now they're saying no, you can actually do it at room temperature, and so the brain is functioning in that way, which opens up. It open now. If that's true, I mean, and this was part of my interview. I said, well, if that's true, that kind of changes everything, right? How we look at stuff. And what's so interesting about sort of the sociology of science is that even when you have is how do things that are so disruptive get legitimacy within a sociology of an institutional structure that doesn't want to disrupt itself. Um, and even when you can, then the financial and career incentives kick in and say, well, yeah, but if you can really do that and you have a room temperature quantum computer and it's biologically based, you grow it, you don't make that's good. That's going to create a lot of opportunities. That will. So I think we're on the cusp of these new ways of thinking about stuff, and being able to come to terms with that a reductive materialism, or making sort of the classical world primary, is that that's just not true. It's, I mean, and there, there's a significant physicists, and I think you cited some of them, but like, I mean, there's Federico Fagan, and there John Wheeler. There's all these other, these are people with huge credentials and contributions, basically saying the same thing in different ways. But it hasn't become it hasn't become a social a centerpiece of how we
And
start
if
to
I
move things.
may throw in another one, who is, the MacArthur Fellow and very famous scientist as well, Stuart Kaufman, who
Oh,
wrote
sure,
At Home
Stuart.
in the Universe. I mean, and he wrote now, I mean, more recently, relatively recently, this Reinventing the Sacred, in which he makes practically
Oh
the
yeah,
same
no,
point.
I knew Stuart. I talked to Stuart a lot, and I mean,
Yes.
and he talked about the idea of the sacred, and I do think that what because I was really interested in Stewart's work and gene regulatory networks and stuff, and just do it. But then I think what Carl has been able to do with his whole active inference and Bayesian mechanics and tying it to the free energy principle and then grounding it in really good formalisms that are now programmable, I think we can really move into creating artifacts, synthetic agents based on these principles. To that point, some of the things we're doing with the Active Inference Institute, and there's some really talented people there, is the ability to recognize. If you look at the large language models, is that they're in a sense they're Hilbert spaces. They have these complex parameters. They're almost like a quantum reference field, and then which you have a prompt, but that goes through them that sort of collapses that into a particular point of view, and then you develop causal models, and this is where and so what we're doing is sort of the interaction between those models and rendering them into a particular causal model that then is an active inference Bayesian model. Then we can start to build what we call biofirms that act in a particular way, and that are embedded in a particular context, and then evolve their own agency, subagents, so the multicellularity over time. And so I think we're able to sort of combine these things in a really interesting way.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd like to take this, from where you are here into the broader issue, which is also part of your lifetime work. And this, I would call it even like maxim, yes, like a quote from John Henry Clippinger, which says that technology becomes policy. I heard it at you first. I don't know
Yeah,
if
yeah.
it's from somewhere else, but if you can, because in the age of singularity and with all what you are talking about, I have great hopes that we can actually find the right path if technology becomes policy and we do it right. But what do you
Yes.
have to say about, can you spell it out for us, technology becomes policy? And of course, how it's working today. I mean, I'm sure you have a lot to say about it.
No, I think, I mean, so I actually coming out with a book, and they're going to have a serialized book on our website, and part of it's called Awakening. And one of the issues that I'm really interested in is how we think about our institutions, quote, democracy. We try to think about it in a technology free way. It's not a it is actually shaped. We live in our ability to govern ourselves and create ourselves is limited, enhanced by our technologies, and our technologies are manifestations of our fundamental understandings, right? So it is, I mean, so that this is why the first principles comes in. What is the underlying science that we can rely upon? I mean, and one of the things I like to say is like, innovations come and go, but science discoveries, it's scientific discoveries forever. It's not a trend. It's like a principle in which you can lean on. And yet, and even science, it has to be revised at times, and we have different interpretations. But I think that yes, that right now within the general narrative is like, oh, technology's out there. I mean, I used to be, I for the last 35 years, I go to the Yale CEO Summit with a friend of mine runs that, and I would always be put in the upper tier in the outer reaches because I was like, okay, well, here's this madman talking about technology, but they're talking about real businesses here. Now it's changed. It's like, uh-oh, the technology is changing the whole nature of the business itself. It's not an externality. It is the, and particularly now with and I would argue this agentic technology is what enables to creating autonomous organizations. I mean, cannot keep up with the speed of which these things learn. I mean, we're discovering this ourselves. I mean, we're running our own experiments, and it's like, geez, I mean, this thing discovered something. It went right. It was pulling together things that would take people years to do, and it's doing it in minutes. Um, so we have to come to terms with that. And yes, it does hallucinate. There are things that are not right. People hallucinate. I mean, so but there are principled ways of doing it that actually allow you to develop cumulative learning. Um, so absolutely, technology is a principle, but we're in a generation of people that think of it as an externality, and as it's the design space of what is possible now.
Uh, what I wanted to say is like kind of taking on from here. Yes. So technology, yes, it's like the medium is the message, and now
Yeah,
technology,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
technology is policy. So
Absolutely, yes,
it's
absolutely. I'm a big fan of his way back too. That was a big book for me. Yeah, yeah,
yes, and I hope you are writing this other one. And you mentioned that you are actually, and I
yeah,
look forward to have you as
yeah. No,
guest
I'd love to have your
when you read
comments
it.
and interaction on these things. Yeah,
Yes. So what I wanted to say here is yes. So and you reminded me of and it was like 20 years ago or more. I don't want to disclose how many years ago when I was awarded the Canada Research Chair, and then I got on the Canada main radio station and so on. They were asking me, okay, and it was the Easter edition, like this one now. It was with futurist Christmas edition, and they were asking because my field was the e-society, which we created with agents, and how agents can represent us humans and help us see the light, which didn't
yeah,
happen unfortunately, and they were asking me, do you see those agents as gods or as angels, or how will we, will the world change? And that was like many years ago.
yeah,
I
yeah,
can say probably as 25 years ago.
yeah, yeah. Sure.
And now the question is, yeah, so, and you alluded to this. So the right way is not to constrain, yeah, not
Right,
to regulate by constraint in the Newtonian model,
right.
but then what is the right way? So how do we govern? Is the right question? How do we govern those agents, or how do we govern with those agents?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
these
no,
are paradigm shifts that are very significant. And from here, I'd like to ask, well, if you have any advice, and I know it's not an easy question, for governments. I mean, how should we change this alignment
Well,
problem in this
well,
context?
I think, I mean, there are some really principled ways of having. No, I mean, the question is, how do you govern in a way that's not captured, right? And how do you maintain the evidence for that? So there is there's a guy named Mick Ashby, who's the grandson of Ross Ashby, who talks about third order cybernetics. And basically, you're saying, okay, well, you have a system modeling a system, um, and this is sort of the law of reversibility. Because you have a system that models a system that the other system doesn't see, that in effect it's outside its control. And can you design something in that way? And that's very similar to the notion, I mean, of a Markov blanket. If you think that um, any sort of a conscious thing that action and involving intelligence, it works with a Markov blanket. But if something's outside its Markov blanket, that can see it that it cannot see, then it can be governed by it. And this is the law of requisite right. So I think there may be some kind of governance. And I sort of was mentioning this to Michael the same way, the same Michael Levin. But the other side of that, I think, is that they're governed by first principles in a sense that is how you design the intentionality of the system itself. And so there is within a whole community, and there's an extension of Michael's work with a whole bunch of developers and some venture people. There are many of whom are Buddhists, I mean, actively practicing, I mean, very, very devout, thoughtful Buddhists. And I would say the people I deal with in the neuroscience world, and many of them are, and they're saying, well, how is it the intentionality of care, that whole principle of care is a sort of an ontological principle of the design of any system, is that should be a initial design point. And I think that's really interesting. I think that's something. Can I design a system, simulate a system that actually has as its self-evidencing, as Carl would say, it self-evidences itself by being a caring system, and not and by that recognizing, not othering, but including and representing, creating larger wholes at every point. I think that I think that is a new ethos. And in the end, so you have a moral principle. What's the antithesis to that? And again, I'll reference another interview we did with David Silverswag, who was neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School, was the dean there for a while, and he was saying, "Well, can you really talk about pathologies? As you can talk about in biology? I mean, is a cancer something? What happens to a cancer? It turns out that mammals and the other ones have cancer. Well, how does cancer happen? And when you have a system that runs away and consumes itself and does not recognize itself as being part of itself. So that is that a principled way of saying there is a pathology? So you design something against that kind of pathology because your ethos is to have something that stays alive, not something that consumes itself, that becomes a parasite on itself. So
And
I
can I
do.
just interject there? Because
Sure.
this is, you got to the point. Yes, you design something which can intervene to
Yeah.
rectify that pathology. And what we think, at least here at SingularityNet, we are building the beneficial singularity. I don't know how much you know
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
our decentralized project. And that is exactly what we are after, to design the intervention for that pathology. And let me tell you, this is, going kind of in the direction of this. I don't know about third order cybernetics much, but I know about second order cybernetics,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because I co-founded the journal Cybernetics and Human
Right. I
Knowing when
remember
I
that.
was a
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
PhD
You're in
student. Yes,
cybernetics.
that was
Right. Right.
again
Right.
like 35 years ago or so.
Right.
I
Right.
shouldn't say it. And so from following from what you are mentioning, that we cannot see the system from the inside and therefore they are self-destructing like cancer cells, but maybe the singularity, maybe the AGI can see, we can design it so it can see the system and intervene where, and maybe incorporate that sort of super wisdom, because we're talking about the super intelligence, super wisdom that can actually guide us to get out of that self-destructive pathology. And I wanted to point to some, and also, by the way, Wilber and his co-authors of this book, First Principles and
Yeah.
First Values, he is mentioning Buddhism, and that if we incorporate Buddhism, and we can actually do that because there's like motivation can be incorporated into software agents and drives and
Oh yeah.
intent and all that. So we can incorporate compassion and motivation towards good into agents. There is work, more recent work now, amazingly enough, sponsored by OpenAI, which is done by the Meaning Alignment Institute. And they are building moral graphs. AGI is built on knowledge graphs.
Right.
But
Right.
those knowledge graphs are, connected in arbitrary ways. But if we connect them to embed that kind of morality into them. And what they do, they are running experiments. They are asking ChatGPT to give case examples. Like, the typical one is if you are driving and there's
Right. Rather classic.
10 kids and an old man who to choose to hurt or whatever.
Yeah.
So they are giving those, but they are giving them to humans. And humans then decide which is the way to go. And based on that, they are attuning the knowledge graphs. So they are transformed into moral graphs. And there is hope that once we have the AGI embedded on those moral graphs, they will be able to, first of all, guide us when we are out of line, but also show us the way out of our pathology. I just wonder what you think about that, and then what would be your take if you believe it can be realized. So
I get
like
my
speaking of the getting us out of the zero sum power games.
well, my antenna go up when I hear a moralistic, what can be a moralistic position, and that human beings would be some group is supposed to embody a moralistic prescriptive. I think that's a vulnerability point. And I do. This is not to say that I don't think you can have AI system. Again, I keep it very general in the sense of what it means to keep alive and keep diversity. But the limiting factor should not be human perceptions of this and embodiments. I think that the making us the standard of this is a fallacy. I mean, I'll just go and I
I agree.
and so and because that's so easily captured by everything. I mean, and I think what is moral is highly dynamic under multiple situations, and to just think that there's a single sort of rule or algorithm that can state this is moral and this is not under what condition. I think that's extremely problematic.
So go ahead.
Go ahead.
Or I just want you to take on from here and then ask if if, or I would not say if because we are at singularity now, so we are just saying when.
Yeah.
These AIs / robots, machines develop self-awareness, then how do we govern in that world? How
Well, I
should
don't think
governance systems evolve?
but see, I come back to Lovelock's position is that it's not we're co-evolving. We're not telling we're instances of consciousness ourselves, and we're not, and so we shouldn't assume our classical embodiment of it at a point in time as being an absolute reference point.
And this is Donald Hoffman also, because he said there's one consciousness, and actually consciousness creates brains and not vice versa. That is quite
well. I mean, this is the whole quantum thing. Is you have these multiple reference points. So and this is actually Fagan's point is that there's certain irreducible nature of a consciousness, but and they have their own local manifestation, but at the same time they're a manifestation of a global non-reductive consciousness. So we can't. This is captured in a lot of religious traditions. I mean, the folk science of that, or folk religion, the danger of idolatry, the danger of trying to collapse everything into a fixed set of axioms and saying no, and then the worship of that, and try to collapse the world into a fixed point. That's just the opposite of this. And so that's our inclination, and particularly under conditions of fear or conditions under certainty, that people want to collapse complexity and fix it. And so that in turn leads to cancerous behaviors. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, so I hope to have an interview very soon with a guy named Will Radcliffe, who's an evolutionary biologist, and I was at a retreat with him and some other people, and he was talking that nature solved the alignment problem, and 2 million years ago, and he was talking about the whole idea of going prokaryotic to eukaryotic, to be actually to have two different things living together, and they're able to create complexity, multicellular complexity.
And I met Radcliffe at the Institute of Complex Systems, by the way, which is in Boston.
Yeah,
And yes, with Yanir Bar-Yam, and he was invited speaker like again some decades ago. Yes, so his work
yeah,
is
that's right.
titanic.
That's right. So, but I think we're starting to understand these mechanisms, and I think we can represent these mechanisms. And so, when we think of governance, it's. I mean, I think of governance in terms of these kind of mechanisms that and then we can excel. I mean, the other thing is by working in a virtual space, you can generate millions of generations of possibilities and select among them, which you can't do in biological
Can
space.
I just make an interjection, because this is a very big pain point for me, because I've been working all my life on this and I'm very disillusioned. You say we're just starting to understand. I have to say, and I have a book by Smuts on holistic evolution,
Yeah.
holism evolution. And this is from the 1923, and it is. So we are not starting to understand them. We have understood them long ago, and there's a lot of work on that and on complex systems. However, we did not consider it. And the question is, why didn't we consider it? Why didn't we use these models? Why did we create our, like fantastic Newtonian society? Maybe
Well,
I
because
shouldn't ask you that, but just because we're not starting to understand, I'm hoping that we are starting to consider these
Well, I
results.
think what it makes a difference is that it's rendered into technology. I think it is so there you can have opinions. I mean, it's like, to me, it's quantum mechanics is like, well, now we have quantum computers that actually are doing things, and and so once you render it into technology, and that's why these agents are really important. It makes these capabilities implementable, practical in a space-time context, in a classical world context. And I think that's novel to the last 3 to 5 years. I mean, we've been talking. I mean, as I say, I mean, both of us have been interested in these things for many years, right? And you have the intuition, and people will say, but it never got traction. And now, suddenly, I mean, so if you can do the work of people, high-level cognitive work for people with an agent, and then that that that
Yes.
has real import. And
Coming
if
back
you
to
have
technology is policy. Yes,
yeah,
technology is.
exactly.
That's
It
exactly the
becomes very
point.
real.
Yes.
But we
Yes.
have trained people not to think of technology as an externality. You go to the Kennedy School. I mean, I spent a lot of time at Harvard, and the policy in the world back and forth to Washington used to come in and all that. I just there's a mindset. It is technophobic, and then the same time is that when the technology community, the technology community is very itself not well informed about the policy issues, so they come at it in a sort of a cowboy mentality, and it's much more nuanced than that, and it's not everyone's a bad guy, and then everyone's. I mean, you're trying to make a transition from a very static, sort of hierarchical, classical, industrial system into a highly flexible, dynamic, self-learning system that we can only now implement. And so I think is a new category of leadership that needs to come into this, a new generation of leadership, and I haven't seen it. I'm hoping to see that. I see glimmers of it, but I don't see it yet.
And that's exactly what I was alluding to. Aligning. I mean, the question is, because everybody is talking about, well, how can we ensure that AI is aligned with universal, with human values, right? And you just say we are not the center. We are not the center. We're instants, and this evolutionary process. So the question then becomes, are we aligning humanity with universal values first, and then maybe we are looking at aligning AI? Do we even need to think about this? And if we don't think about this, don't we risk being dislocated by the AGI, which will align itself, and that is again Novacin,
Well, I think.
with universal values? What's the path forward here?
Well, I think that there's I mean, I'll get back to the Lovelock. Okay, I mean, there's a sort of implicit presumption that a new kind of intelligence is sort of a terminator, an alien intelligence. I mean, and so, I mean, you get Harari makes this. I mean, it's like, well, is it really alien, or are we just manifestations of the same thing? I mean, and so, I mean, and when we look at, and people say, oh, well, animals, we have anthropomorphized when we talk about animal, but we've evolved in a common way. And so we had common structures. And so we are a part of a common process. I mean, it's not like this thing has come out of nowhere where it's part of the physics of life. We're part of the same thing. I mean, we just may be a particular space-time representation of an instance of that process, and it's not necessarily adversarial. I mean, it's like it's a part of a broader process. I don't. It's just the presumption that they're going to be these venomous aliens, they're going to reptilians forms, they're going to eat us. I don't think is necessarily valid. I mean, there could be challenges in our particular form. We may not be fit. I mean, we're not, and so we're no longer the apex species. And so be it. I mean,
This is hard. This is
I
hard
mean,
to
there
swallow.
was a conflict. I think was it not with Sergey, but uh, Larry Page and Musk had a big fight about this, and Musk is saying,
Yes.
okay, well, you say
Speciesism. Yes,
you're
yes, the
species,
species.
and say, well, yeah, but think about your abstraction, think about your fundamentals. If the universe is conscious, and that is a fundamental process, and we're interfacing between the quantum and the physical, then why should any particular three-dimensional representation be the absolute form? It just doesn't make sense. So that's where I come out on that.
Yes, it is a pill hard to swallow, for
Yeah.
most people, of course. That's, yeah, obviously. So now I think, like, I can just have a sequel here with one another kind of hard question, maybe, but I give you full agency here. If
Okay.
you were to have the power to, of a magic wand that would make anything happen right now, what would you do in the era of the singularity? Would you, and I don't give you options, you can just take it, but I'm just saying that, which is the direction that I'm thinking. Like, what would you do? Would you help humanity thrive in the era of the singularity? Would you help simply the AGIs to thrive and take
You see,
on the
I
evolution?
don't think that. I think you're pausing an opposition. That's not saying opposition. I'm
Okay, so
saying.
what would you do?
So
Dot.
I'm saying you
Or
actually, here's
question
this
mark.
principle of how does, I mean, this is something we're working on right now. This is what we have, a team of people really quite committed to this. So the idea is to actually, what does it mean to create a system that incentivizes the not just the preservation of life, but the enhancement of living things. I mean, I've been very interested in climate change and biodiversity, and I do think we're coming up against, if we continue in the path we do, we're going to be in a really, really bad state, and it would trigger it. So we really have to not look at nature as an externality, but actually develop biomimetic institutions that, in a sense, value the creation of a living things. And so, how does that translate into the what business models drive everything? So what are the new kind of business models that can come out of this that actually value and say natural assets, the enhancement of natural assets, and so that gets into tokenomics. That it gets in a new kind of tokenomics that I'm interested in on this. And so, how do I develop a new kind of tokenomics that doesn't result in extraction, but is also being able to then be able to reward, the diversity and biodiversity.
Yes, and this because you mentioned this nature is not an externality. Polanyi actually got the Nobel Prize for saying, not saying, but waking us up to the reality that nature is not a commodity, and that actually
Right.
we are part of nature, and we forgot that, and
Exactly.
we are so lost on our on our
Exactly.
path.
The incentive is the commodification of ourselves and nature and the biosphere. Well, that's not a survival tactic. So but and so again, I think there's a principled way of doing this. I think we're not arbitrarily issuing tokens. We can have a principled way of doing the supply based on free energy principle, and we can achieve autonomy. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is the allocation of tokens. We use the free energy principle as a basis, saying here's value created, actually reduced uncertainty. That is a new unit of value. That is not inflationary. You increase the pie, that in a sense. Then we use something called the Shapley value, which has come out of game theory, cooperative game theory. Uh, Lloyd Shapley got a Nobel Prize for this, and it allocates tokens based upon your marginal contribution to that outcome. So, and at the same time, you're creating an incentive curve that actually is designed to solve these problems, and then create an asset class that reflects that as a public good. So that's where that's where I end up on this.
That's amazing because I mean, of course, we've been trying. I mean, not we, but the
Sure.
tokenomics community trying to figure it out for a long time,
Well,
and
the
it's kind
economics. I mean,
of
I've been
didn't.
involved now. I mean, it is one of the most enclosed worlds. It's now
Yes.
starting to open up a bit, but for the longest time, it was there was a strict doctrine. Now you got behavioral economics. You've got Bayesian. They're exploring the edges that and. But now, if you go back to first principles, you're really able to see things function, and design. Again, you talk about technology. It's not just technology, policy. It's science instead of policy, actually. And it's open. It's you can challenge it. It's not doctrinaire. I mean, if it's not working and you have a counterfactual, it's a significant counterfactual, then you update your system. You're constantly learning. um, and I think this is the way of building systems, and I think this addresses some of the fundamental questions. And on that basis, I'm pretty optimistic. I think it's a horse race. I don't know, you know.
Amazing. So there is a way, there is a path, and we have the technology. Speaking of, yes, to build those policies in a generative way, and a generative economy. Yes, it's
Right,
it's
exactly, exactly.
wow. I want to be a part of that, and
Well, okay,
I
you're
hope
in.
we also at Singularity Net, of course, would like to contribute to that. So we should have
Sure.
follow-ups, more concrete work on that, because there have been many attempts, and Will Rudick is doing that with his grassroots economics, trying to look at in more
Right.
indigenous
No, that's
practices
right.
in. Yes, and a lot of attempts, but I want to see it happen
Yeah,
faster.
we want to test it. I mean, I want to make it work. I don't, and that's not just performative. It's like, okay, I think this is a good idea. It meets these
Mhm.
criteria. Can we really do it?
Yes.
And so far,
And
I think
yes,
so.
we want to help on that. I
That'd be
really
great.
hope from my heart. So I think we covered quite a lot. I have a last question, but the question is first, before the last question, if you want to say something else, if there's a topic which I missed, or you had some other things to cover.
No, I mean, we are as said right from the beginning. We're tracking a similar set of topics,
Yes,
and
and
we're
we didn't talk a lot about Michael Levin and how these biological models can actually maybe can they inspire?
No, I
Have
think
they
we're actually, I mean, but
inspired
we're really working with, and
governance?
there are other people at Michael Levin's group, they're working on how to incorporate those principles into the economic model. And
Mm,
so this idea, I mean, when he talks about the cognitive, the cognitive zone or the cognitive glue,
the
and then he talks about
cone, yes.
multifunctional and multiscalar systems that are actually, it's like, okay, I think we have ideas how to implement that as an organizational structure and as a governance a system of governance. And so, yeah.
You know what I just wonder what's your opinion about that. When I came across Michael Levin's work, my kind of aha moment, and I think of course it was biased because I wanted to be so,
Yeah,
was
yeah,
like we have wisdom embedded in our being, because he said we have this cognition and it kind of goes together with the goodness bias and all this.
yeah,
So I just wonder, what do you think about his take that we really have this, of course, cognition, and he is proving
right,
that the cells and even more down
right.
the turtles down, all the way down, but there is this, like, we have also wisdom because we're biased towards goodness. What's your take on that? Is it speculative purely, or you think
No,
it can be a
I
reality?
think these are really. I mean, it's not just unique to him. I mean, it's. I mean, there is. I mean, the Michael's work with Carl. They work with Chris Fields. They work. I mean, these people it's sort of an implicit consensus and point of view of how to look at things that is directing their kind of research and their kind of and buildings and what I find is that these intuitions, these notions are being highly productive in actually building and explaining things otherwise we couldn't explain it. When Michael has talked about, he said, well, there's been what they call teleophobia. In other words, in biology, anything that had agentic notions or teleology in it was considered to be off, you would kill your career. And so he's been able and to break with that and then pursue these ideas when he thinks that some of the materials are themselves agentic at a fundamental level. I mean, that is like, okay, that is total heresy within the biology of 15 years ago. I mean, he'd be drummed out of the core. But the fact is that he builds things and they do things, and he actually is able to achieve things, and there's evidence base, and he makes that big point. And I think we're going to move into the evidence base of this stuff in a colossal way that is going to just blow the tops off of people's heads who are locked in the traditional model.
Because now
And there's going to be a
technology
lot
is
of resistance
enabling
to that.
us.
Yeah.
Yes, and taking on from here, I just now got another question before the last question, because you inspire me for that. And I think you alluded to leaders, but I'd like to ask you, like, explicitly, what advice would you give to young leaders and entrepreneurs in this day and
Young
age?
leaders,
Young leaders and entrepreneurs, yes.
I think, well, that's not an easy question, actually.
No, but I mean, you have so much
I
experience.
mean, I try to reach out to a younger group of believers. I think that what boy is
They are the future. They will be most affected by the
no, no,
singularity, if
it's
at all.
absolutely essential. So yes, they have a certain technology competence, but that's not enough. They have a certain responsibility that I think and I see where this some of the young leadership's coming out, and genuineness is around the question of biofinance and preserving the earth. I mean, I think that immediately affects them. You find a tradition of people now, younger people saying, we're looking at sort of the indigenous peoples and their traditions and how they value nature, and I think that's very very genuine with a number. But they take that and it can be a bit performative. They say, "Oh, I said, but how do you realize that into practice? How do you start to build things that actually do that? And the risks that you're going to take. I mean, this is not something that is not without costs and risk to implement a new era." Not everyone's going to like what you're going to do. It's not going to be. Uh, you're going to have to break with a number of things that you're comfortable with in order to move this new world, and it's got to be. And you're going to have the core set of principles that you really adhere to, and be accountable for. I think that one of the things that worries me a little bit is that there is something that, but it's like, okay, but now you got to do stuff. You got to you got
Exactly,
and you're
and
going to be
depart
accountable for it.
from the instant gratification
Right, right,
society
right,
of
right,
X
right.
and yeah, all this. Yes,
Yeah,
they are very detracted and confused. The
yeah,
young,
yeah,
but
yeah, and
yeah,
so it
that's
can
why it's
be
not an easy answer. So,
exactly. So you can take your ayahuasca and go, okay, fine, but it's like, okay, but now if you're talking about the concrete things that we need to do and build things and actually make the change and be responsible for it and step into the roles of leadership and and think about it novelly and deeply and personally, that and feel accountable for that, rather than just having to hustle something new. Um, so I think it's and out of certain kinds of strife come new kinds of leadership.
and
And
you exactly, and it is, thriving for a purpose, having a mission in life, and I think they are losing that,
I agree.
in the noise of the social networks and all
There's so
that.
much noise right now. There's so
Yes.
much noise, and
So they
it's
will have to be very strong to detach from that and to find the real values in that noise,
but I
and that
think they
is
need to find a North Star that they can orient themselves with, that they're
exactly.
comfortable with.
And what
And I
is
do
that?
think, and I do think this new science is it can be such a North Star. It can be deeply appreciated. We need our new myths. We need our new narratives and new epics. We need this, that people can coalesce emotively, not just intellectually, around these things.
And that's exactly what you are working on. And this leads me to the last question because it fits right in and it's not easier than the other one, unfortunately, or fortunately, because we want to benefit from your wisdom maximally. So, John, I want to ask you, what is the meaning of life to you? And exactly. And does it change in a post singularity era? So, there are two questions hidden there.
I don't think I've been asked that on an interview. Oh, by the way, here it is. I get,
I put you on
uh,
the spot,
no, but
but
I think we're
I'm
getting
sure
closer
you,
to a
you have
sense
an
of what that
answer.
is. I think it's it, and well, here's I'll frame it. I think the
Speaking of
meaning
the
of
North
life,
Star, right? I mean, yes.
for Western society, the meaning of life was to be contained within the classical 3D worlds, and say where everything you can do within that is all there is, and so this is it is the seculars, and then you're saying, well, wait a second, maybe we're a part of something much greater. Maybe there is there our actions are not just in classical space and time, but in an interface with the quantum, the larger notion of it. And then we start to lift that veil. Is, oh my God, this is all this huge universe. I mean, I love it. And I'll throw something in. I had a very weird dream that on this very topic, and I was and I'll share it with his group. But it was funny. I was wandering around and I ran into some people. So, oh, they said they knew me, and I said, "What are you working on?" I said, and so that's interesting. And then the woman said, "Oh, I'm an indigenous person," and she started to levitate, and then she spread her arms and she said, "You're seeing things too narrowly. Here's the whole sky." And she just opened the sky. It was like, and it was like suddenly it's like, no, you're now you've been so confined that you unlearn certain things. You can open yourself to seeing things that seem magical to you. And she would levitate and then she'd come down again. And it was like, well, this can't be. Can other people see that? I see, but is this a hallucination? So it's like, well, I think we're opening the pulling back the veil, and we're allowing ourselves to see things we wouldn't allow ourselves to see. As a child, we might see, but we're taught we could not see it. And now we're seeing it through a science. Now we're thinking it through a science, and we're sharing it with everyone, and it's becoming real.
Exactly. And that's, of course, it's also an evolving thing, an evolving
Oh,
concept,
totally,
the meaning
totally.
of life with evolution. That's why I think it's a hard question, especially for a person
Well, it's
like you
not a
who
fixed
is.
thing. It's
Yes,
not. What is the mean? No, it's an open
exactly.
process.
exactly. It's a look at the sky and discover
Yeah,
more. And
exactly,
like
exactly.
exactly like now with, as you mentioned, with Hoffman, and new dimensions and new ways of seeing. And yes, it's
Seeing and
I think
being.
that's the discovery, maybe the meaning
Yes.
itself.
And be comfortable with that. Be comfortable with that.
Yes, be open and not afraid. Exactly,
Right, right,
comfortable
right.
maybe, but at least not afraid to step
Not
into the
afraid.
unknown. Well,
Exactly.
John, amazing. Thank you so much, and I'm happy
Thank
that
you.
I collected so much wisdom from this
Oh, no, well, likewise.
conversation.
Likewise. This is a great
And
conversation.
I
Enjoy it. I hope we
repeat,
can keep it going.
a
Yes.
commitment that we will contribute
Okay,
to
well,
your
thank you.
work, and
All
we
right.
really
I
would
really
like, and
appreciate
we
that.
will have a follow-up
Okay.
conversation.
Very good.
Thank you so much
All right.
again.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for
All right.
honoring us with this
Bye-bye.
conversation.